their destination, King Ferdinand Charles might have carried them back to an endless chain of evils. But his task would have been a harder one than the Council's. The moral shock of the atomic bombs had been a profound one, and for a while the cunning side of the human animal was overpowered by its sincere realization of the vital necessity for reconstruction. The litigious and trading spirits cowered together, scared at their own consequences. Men thought twice before they sought mean advantages in the face of the unusual eagerness to realize new aspirations. And when at last the weeds revived again and claims began to sprout, they sprouted upon the stony soil of law courts reformed, of laws that pointed to the future instead of the past, and under the blazing sunshine of a transforming world. A new literature, a new interpretation of history, were springing into existence. A new teaching was already in the schools, a new faith in the young. The worthy man who forestalled the building of a research city for the English upon the Sussex Downs by buying up a series of estates, was dispossessed and laughed out of court when he made his demand for some preposterous compensation. The owner of the discredited DOS patents makes his last appearance upon the scroll of history as the insolvent proprietor of a paper called the Cry for Justice, in which he duns the world for £100,000,000. That was the ingenious Doss's idea of justice, that he ought to be paid about £5,000,000 annually because he had annexed the salvage of one of Holston's discoveries. Doss came at last to believe quite firmly in his right, and he died a victim of conspiracy mania in a private hospital at Nice. Both of these men would have probably have ended their days enormously wealthy, and of course ennobled in the England of the opening 20th century, and it is just this novelty of their fates that marks the quality of the new age. The new government early discovered the need of a universal education, to fit men to the great conceptions of its universal rule. It made no wrangling attacks on the local, racial, and sectarian forms of religious profession that at the time divided the earth into a patchwork of hatreds and distrusts. It left these organizations to make their peace with God in their own time. But it proclaimed, as if it were a mere secular truth, that sacrifice was expected from all, that respect had to be shown to all. It revived schools or set them up afresh all around the world, and everywhere these schools taught the history of war and the consequences and moral of the last war. Everywhere it was taught not as a sentiment, but as a matter of fact, that the salvation of the world from waste and contention was the common duty and occupation of all men and women. These things, which are now the elementary commonplaces of human intercourse, seemed to the counsellors of Brissago, when first they dared to proclaim them, marvellously daring discoveries, not untouched by doubt, that flushed the cheek and fired the eye. The Council placed all this educational reconstruction in the hands of a committee of men and women, which did its work during the next few decades with remarkable breadth and effectiveness. The Educational Committee was, and is, the correlative upon the mental and spiritual side of the Redistribution Committee, and prominent upon it, and indeed for a time quite dominating it, was a Russian named Karenin, who was singular in being a congenital cripple. His body was bent so that he walked with difficulty, suffered much pain as he grew older, and had at last to undergo 2 operations. The second killed him. Already malformation, which was to be seen in every crowd during the Middle Ages, so that the crippled beggar was, as it were, an essential feature of the human spectacle, was becoming a strange thing in the New World. It had a curious effect upon Karenin's colleagues. Their feeling towards him was mingled with pity and a sense of inhumanity. that it needed usage rather than reason to overcome. He had a strong face, with little bright brown eyes rather deeply sunken, and a large, resolute, thin-lipped mouth. His skin was very yellow and wrinkled, his hair iron gray. He was at all times an impatient and sometimes an angry man, but this was forgiven him because of the hot wire of suffering that was manifestly thrust through his being. At the end of his life, his personal prestige was very great. To him far more than any contemporary it is due, that self-abnegation, self-identification with the spirit world, was made the basis of universal education. That general memorandum to the teachers which is the keynote of the modern educational system, was probably entirely his work. "Whosoever should save his soul should lose it," he wrote. That is the device upon the seal of this document, and the starting point of all we have to do. It is a mistake to regard it as anything but a plain statement of fact. It is the basis for your work. You have to teach self-forgetfulness, and everything else that you have to teach is contributory and subordinate to that end. Education is the release of man from self. You have to widen the horizons of your children, encourage and intensify their curiosity and their creative impulses, and cultivate and enlarge their sympathies. That is what you are for. Under your guidance and the suggestions you will bring to bear on them, you have to shed the old Adam of instinctive suspicions, hostilities, and passions, and to find themselves again in the great being of the universe. The little circles of their egotisms have to be opened out until they become arcs in the sweep of the racial purpose. And this that you teach to others you must learn also sedulously yourselves. Philosophy, discovery, art, every sort of skill, every sort of service, love. These are the means of salvation from that narrow loneliness of desire, that brooding preoccupation with self and egotistical relationships, which is hell for the individual, treason to the race, and exile from God. Section 12. As things round themselves off and accomplish themselves, one begins for the first time to see them clearly. From the perspectives of a new age one can look back upon the great and widening stream of literature with a complete understanding. Things link up that seem disconnected, and things that were once condemned as harsh and aimless are seen to be but factors in the statement of a gigantic problem. An enormous bulk of the sincerer writing of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries falls together now in an unanticipated unanimity. One sees it as a huge tissue of variations upon one theme, the conflict of human egotism and personal passion and narrow imaginations on the one hand, against the growing sense of wider necessities and a possible, more spacious life. That conflict is in evidence in so nearly a work as Voltaire's Candide, for example, in which the desire for justice as well as happiness beats against human contrariety, and takes refuge at last in a forced and inconclusive contentment with little things. Candide was but one of the pioneers of a literature of uneasy complaint that was presently an innumerable multitude of books. The novels more particularly of the 19th century, if one excludes the mere storytellers from our consideration, witness to this uneasy realization of changes that call for effort and the lack of that effort. In 1,000 aspects, now tragically, now comically, now with a funny affectation of divine detachment, a countless host of witnesses tell their story of lives fretting between dreams and limitations. Now one laughs, now one weeps, now one reads with a blank astonishment at this huge and almost unpremeditated record of how the growing human spirit, now warily,